So yeah, I'm delighted to welcome everybody to this online lunchtime talk from the Foundling Museum. It's to mark Trafalgar Day and also to celebrate the life of a former Foundling boy, George King, who's at the heart of our current exhibition, Fighting Talk. His autobiography is the kind of starting point for that show. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Helen Berry. She's a professor and head of history at the University of Exeter and author of Orphans of Empire, published by the Oxford University Press. And that was the research which really was the kind of starting point that inspired us to work with Helen on the exhibition, which she's curated with us. And I'm also delighted to welcome her colleague, Dr. James Davey, who's a lecturer in naval and maritime history at the University of Exeter. And he works on the Britain and its maritime world and the Royal Navy through the kind of 17th, 18th and early 19th centuries, and its sort of political, economic and social context. And he's the author of a wonderful publication, In Nelson's Wake, the Navy and the Napoleonic Wars. So he's particularly knowledgeable and expert person to have on hand for Trafalgar Day. So we're delighted to have him with us. And the event today is in association with the University of Exeter Centre for Maritime Historical Studies. And without too much further ado, I will hand over to Helen and James to lead us forward.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Thanks to you and our friends at the Foundling Museum and to everyone on this call, wherever you're joining us from. I'm blown away. It's such an international event. That's fantastic. Everyone's very welcome. I'm conscious that some of you on the call may have a very particular interest in naval history and particularly military history, while others of you might be interested in social history or indeed the history of children who have had an experience of being raised in care. So lots of different people with lots of different interests on the call. We hope there will be something of interest for everyone. And there's a chance for you to ask questions at the end. So perhaps you've seen the exhibition or just heard about it, or perhaps it's all completely new. I'll just mention that there are a lot of materials about the exhibition, excuse me, on the Fighting Talk website through the Foundling Museum. So do have a look at that. And there should be a video tour shortly available on the website that you'll be able to have a look at for free, and you'll see me walking around the exhibition and talking through the various artifacts and stages. So I really hope you enjoy that. I went for a run this morning by the sea. I live on the south coast of Devon, and it was amazing looking out across the ocean. And I thought to myself, this is such a special day, the anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. And when I first read the autobiographical account written by George King, the only surviving account we know of written by a foundling born in the 18th century. So it's a very, very precious document. Its historical significance hadn't really, I think, been realised. There are so many treasures in the archives. It was nobody's fault, but the archive relating to the Foundling Hospital, as you probably know, is absolutely huge. So to have found this little nugget, this gem of a document, was really exciting. And George talks about his experiences and his inner life, his emotions. So he talks about his reminiscences of being raised by his nurse and then going through being schooled. He calls it his school, the Foundling Hospital. And he temporarily becomes an apprentice to a confectioner in the city of London, but he runs away for reasons which you'll certainly learn about if you go to the exhibition. I won't say too much about that, but the moment I'd like to take us to is the moment that he is press ganged on board HMS Polyphemus. So he runs away to Chatham. He has a romantic notion, I think, of going to sea, but the realities of life as an ordinary seaman soon hit home. But very, very quickly, I mean, almost in a year of him being press ganged, he finds himself right at the centre of the fleet that is amassing in the area, the stretch of water that we now know of famously as the iconic Trafalgar. And I just wanted to read to you a little extract from my book, Orphans of Empire, because I think that will help us set the scene and lead us into James's fuller consideration of the context for this material. in relation to the Royal Navy and the history of something that we do and that we're distinctive for at Exeter, which is the history from below of the Navy and maritime history, considering ordinary people's lives and experiences. So as part of Nelson's decoy squadron, George King and the rest of the crew of the Polyphemus set sail under the command of Captain Robert Redmill and proceeded to the Gut of Gibraltar. There they waited. During the night of the 20th, 21st of October, 1805, George recalled overhearing a conversation between Admiral Lord Nelson himself and the ship's captain. And he says, at about 10 minutes to 12, according to George, quote, we drifted alongside the commander-in-chief when we were hailed by his lordship, who accosted us thus, what ship? The captain answered, Polyphemus. When his lordship said, Redmill, I suppose we shall have a warm day tomorrow. And the captain answered, I hope so, my lord. George helped keep watch until 4 a.m. and barely had time to return to his hammock when the signal was made that the French fleet was in sight. Quote, we were then entirely fit for action. The British fleet was soon in a two-line formation, the first time such a maneuver had been tried. At 8 o'clock in the morning, George recalled, quote, we piped the breakfast, it being Monday, Banyan Day. The most part ate their dinner for breakfast, and each man was served with half a pint of wine. We had 3 butts of water on the lower deck and 3 on the main deck with the heads knocked in. Our bread bags with our other provisions were stowed in the launch on the booms. At 9:30 in the morning on the day of the Battle of Trafalgar, former foundling George King wrote, quote, Nelson made the signal that England expects every man will do his duty. The officers were encouraged by their commander-in-chief to urge their men to behave gallantly, and 3 hurrahs were given by the ship's company. George had a moment to notice the mild wind, smooth sea, and, quote, the beautiful view of the combined fleets which had formed a crescent and the centre of the enemy's line was the Spanish admiral, his flag flying on board the Santissima Trinidada. The British fleet had 27 ships against the combined fleet's 33. Nelson issued a plan of attack to his officers in 3 parts, the last of which was to be used at the discretion of his trusted officers at decisive moments of battle. Quote, I think it will surprise and confuse the enemy. They won't know what I am about. It will bring forward at pell-mell battle, and that is what I want. While the French traditionally fired high, aiming for masts and rigging, the British Navy had established a convention of running swiftly into the single line of enemy ships before discharging fire fast, low, and at close quarters. George witnessed this for himself. Collingwood's ship, the Royal Sovereign, commenced the battle at 10 minutes to 12, quote, by running under the stern of a Spanish 3-decker and a French 80, and pouring a few broadsides into the stern of one and the bow of the other. The English ships were nimble with superior gunnery tactics. The larboard bumpkin's head of the Polyphemus was shot off, but this mishap did not prevent her from running under a French ship and a Spanish ship, pouring broadside ammunition into each. Quote, there not being sufficient wind to carry away the smoke, we could hardly see the ship we was engaging, recalled George, writing in a way that directly conjures his speaking voice as he told the story of this, the most heroic moment of his life. He goes on, it was a very warm, sultry day. We stripped ourselves to trousers only and blazed away for 3 hours, I being quartered at the second gun on the forecastle. By 4 p.m, shrouded in a pall of smoke, the men could make out that the French ship Achille was on fire. Peering over the hammock netting that covered the larboard, George could see as the smoke cleared that a number of ships, quote, both us and the enemy, totally dismasted, and all appeared to be in confusion. 2 more hours passed and smaller vessels were sent to retrieve hundreds of drowning men from the waters, just as the Achille blew up with a tremendous explosion, burying all the slain and wounded. Some 200 French prisoners were brought on board the Polyphemus and placed below deck under guard. Then George mentioned perfunctorily, quote, the commander-in-chief being slain. Admiral Collingwood shifted his flag from the Royal Sovereign into the Euryalus frigate and at this time it commenced to blow a fresh breeze. 449 British men lost their lives that day, including Admiral Lord Nelson, with the combined fleet suffering about 10 times as many fatalities. The action was all over, and all hands were put towards securing the vessel and repairing damage. At midnight, the men took their first refreshment since that morning's breakfast and fell upon any bread, cheese, or meat they could find, and another half pint of wine each. As a caution, each man retired to his hammock armed with a cutlass and a brace of pistols. But he was not yet out of danger. Having survived the perils of battle, George turned over in exhausted sleep and accidentally flashed one of the brace of pistols, quote, with the muzzle direct in my left armpit, which did not go off, otherwise it must have cost my life. The following day, Admiral Collingwood toured the fleet, and according to George, the ship's company manned the riggings and saluted the hero with 3 hearty cheers. The privilege fell to the Polyphemus to tow HMS Victory, bearing their slain commander through to safe port in Gibraltar. There's so much to think about in that account, and I'm seated right here next to someone who knows a great deal about this subject, and I think we'll probably want to explore a little bit more what memory does when sailors like George recalled many years later, and he was writing this account in his 50s, of events that he'd taken part in when he was just a teenager. So the way in which these stories get told, the narrative embellishments, I think we want to explore some of this further. Also, just to highlight some of the items in the exhibition, I think give form and shape and weight to that story. So the actual figurehead of the ship, the Polyphemus, is in the exhibition, and it's an object that George and his fellow sailors would have probably touched on a daily basis for luck. And we even have a pair of ordinary seamen's trousers, original early 19th century sailors' trousers. So some of those incidental references there, it's incredible that some of these actual objects survive. So I'm going to hand over to James now for the next section. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. Just get the PowerPoint up. Can everyone see that on their screens? Someone could just give me a quick thumbs up or something. Kathleen,
yes, I can see it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. Great. Well, thanks, Helen, for that very evocative opening. I think what I'd like to do over the next sort of 5-10 minutes is just talk for a while about the wider significance of Trafalgar and try and place it into some kind of context. There are some basic things that we know about the battle. We know that it was fought on the 21st of October, 1805, between British and a Franco-Spanish force. We know at the end of the battle, the combined fleet had lost, either sunk or captured, around 18 ships. But what we think about Trafalgar next, its wider cultural, social, political significance, I think, is a little murkier. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. Often, our first thoughts are the sort of intensity and chaos of battle. Many of you, I think, will be familiar with this painting produced by Turner a couple of decades after the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, pretty much everything about this painting is inaccurate. And when this painting was released and a number of sailors from Trafalgar were shown it, they were all furious because they felt that he hadn't at all attempted to capture what had happened that day. But really, this wasn't a painting for sailors. This was a painting for the nation. It was the attempt to put Trafalgar into some kind of national context. And that's why you see HMS Victory in the foreground. You can see Nelson's famous signal sort of fluttering down. And then right at the bottom of the painting, you can see this group of people, many of whom are placing themselves in very heroic poses, which again annoyed the sailors that saw it a few decades later. But nonetheless, this is a painting that I think helps us understand what Trafalgar came to mean for people into the 19th century. We also might think of the man who commanded the British fleet at Trafalgar, Horatio Nelson, probably the most famous portrait of him you can see here left on the screen. And then also a famous print that did the rounds in the months and years after the battle, demonstrating him showing to his captains on the evenings before the battle exactly what he wanted them to do. Much as Helen's described earlier, this right-angled attack towards the combined fleet to take them by surprise and to ensure that a decisive battle was fought. What I want to suggest today, though, is that the true significance of Trafalgar isn't really in what happened tactically that day or the strategic consequences. If anything, actually, if you look in more detail at the tactical and strategic history of this battle, it actually demonstrates its insignificance, if anything. Certainly, the French and Spanish lost a number of ships, but so did Britain, at least temporarily. It's been estimated by historians that 15 or 16 British ships were so damaged they were basically inoperable for the next couple of years. So they were essentially taken out of the power equation of the naval war in Europe. And also when we think about the strategic consequences of this battle, there is a bit of a question mark. So, for example, this battle did very little to change the course of the Napoleonic Wars. This battle was fought in 1804, and the Napoleonic Wars would continue until 1814, with another sort of epilogue during the 100 Days in 1815. So clearly it didn't make a huge difference to the way the war was going. In fact, a battle that did transform the way the war was being fought was fought on land a few weeks later, the Battle of Austerlitz, when Napoleon would win arguably his greatest and certainly most significant victory that gave him an unprecedented command of the continent. In the context of Austerlitz, Trafalgar actually didn't mean that much. And that's something that the British government knew all too well. Some people have argued that the Battle of Trafalgar ended this invasion threat that had been building. This France's attempts to move an army from the northern coast of France into Britain, but that had actually been, that threat had been finished a couple of months earlier. In fact, it was exactly that invasion army that Napoleon was using at Austerlitz to beat the Austrian and Prussian army there. And even historians that have suggested that Trafalgar ended the war at sea, that this was this sort of cumulative moment of triumph for the British Navy, after which no other nation had a chance on the oceans. That's also not really true. Just a few months after the battle, two large fleets would leave Brest, two large French fleets, I should clarify, leave Brest, go out into the Atlantic and cause absolute havoc for the next couple of years. And the British Navy could do nothing about it. So in lots of ways then, we might question Trafalgar's significance. But I think it is obviously hugely significant, and it is in two important ways. Firstly, its cultural significance. And this, as I said, stems from what the British government thought was going on in late 1805. When they heard the news of Trafalgar, they knew only too well that the war still was not going very well. They also heard the news of Austerlitz. They realized that the war was going to last for another few years at least. So they needed a moment of triumph, something to improve the morale of the nation and sort of steel the British populace for another few years of war. And this victory at Trafalgar gave them the opportunity to do that. What's really interesting, and why I'm using the word propaganda to describe what's going on, is Collingwood's, the second in command's dispatches, arrive back at the Admiralty, and they very, very carefully go through it, and they eradicate all of the lines that suggest that British ships were damaged, that Collingwood didn't know where the remaining French ships had gone, and indeed on the sort of his anxieties about the wider state of the war. All of these lines are carefully removed. And so the battle that is presented to the nation through the London Gazette Ordinary in early November is this untarnished victory, but it wasn't necessarily a very accurate portrayal of what happened that day. The other thing the government do is, of course, arrange a state funeral for Nelson, who they turn into this national martyr. Nelson was the first commoner, and I use that word in inverted commas, and he was a lord, of course, at the time, But he was the first person who had been born a commoner to receive a state funeral, I think in over a century. So this is not something that happens very often, but it's one further example of the government of the time using the powers that they have, creating this national spectacle. Very few members of Nelson's family were invited to his funeral. His lover and partner, Emma Hamilton, certainly wasn't invited. This wasn't a funeral for his family. This was a funeral for the nation, a moment where they could come together, recognize this man that had given his life in the service of their country, and essentially set an example for them all to follow. So you can see on the slide here, the funeral procession that went up the Thames to Admiralty Dock, and then up the Strand to St. Paul's, where of course the body remains till this day. What I think is really interesting is that this works. People identify with Nelson, they identify with Nelson. They are able to use this institution and this person as a way to think about themselves as British. On the screen here, you can see just a few of the sort of mementos and manufactures that were produced in the aftermath of Trafalgar. A perfume bottle, a big gin bottle, and then a snuff box on the bottom left. And then on the right is possibly my favorite object when talking about Trafalgar and its wider meaning. It's a textile sampler. It's in the collections of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. It's a textile sampler made by a young girl called Mary Gill in Dudley in 1808, and you can see the inscription right at the bottom. Now, she was about 14 years old at the time, living in Dudley, pretty much about as far from the sea in Britain as you can possibly get. And yet still Nelson and the Navy and his death at Trafalgar meant something to her, enough for her to spend many, many hours producing this beautiful sampler. Now, she had probably never seen a ship before in her life, never seen the sea in her life, but still it meant something to her. And I think that's just a really good way of thinking about that wider cultural significance of the battle. The other area I'd like to talk about is the sort of social significance of the battle. And we can think about this in lots of different ways. On the screen here, you can see a representation of the Battle of Trafalgar. It focuses on the moment where Nelson was hit in the left shoulder. So if you look towards the right of the screen, you can see Nelson on the floor with his aides around him. But if you can sort of move your eyes away from that to the left, what I think is amazing about this painting is it gives you this, I think, the best representation of what a battle at sea was like in the long 18th century. So you get some sense of the chaos and the smoke and how everybody is sort of working in pairs and in groups, but without any real ability to take a step back and get a wider sense of the battle. And if we read some of the testimonies from those people who did fight that day, it's all about the few people that were around them, the mess that they were in. That's where your attention was focused during a naval battle like this. And this gives us an avenue into the social world of the Navy in the long 18th century. And as Helen's already mentioned, it's something that we really specialize in here at the University of Exeter. A number of colleagues, as well as ourselves, thinking about the people who made up Britain's maritime world in this period, their experiences, their agendas, their aims, their ambitions, what they hope to get out of this world. And so on the screen, you can see a couple of objects that help us think about how sailors joined the Navy in this period. Some certainly volunteered, responding to recruitment posters like the one you can see on the left, with this very interesting mix of patriotic language, but also right down at the bottom, you can see the pecuniary advantage that comes with naval service. Come join the Navy, fight for your king, but you can also make some money at the same time. I think it's a nice example of how 18th century patriotism worked. But of course, we have to remember as well that many thousands, tens of thousands, very likely hundreds of thousands of sailors across this period were brought into the Navy against their will through coercion. through the policy of impressment. Press gangs that were able to force sailors against their will to join the Navy. And George King, as we know, was one of these men. We can also start to think about what life was like for these sailors. Battles like Trafalgar were incredibly rare, actually. For the most part, sailors would spend their time going about their daily duties, performing their tasks, but also having time to themselves. So on the right, you can see a wonderful image of sailors sort of relaxing and recreating below decks during the 18th century. The object on the left, I think, is also really interesting. It's become quite traditional amongst naval and maritime historians to think of the ship and the sort of social community on it as something quite different and distinct from that on land. But I think recently people are beginning to rethink this, and increasingly people are interested in the connections between sailors and their families, friends, and loved ones on shore. And I think this object on the left is a really nice way of thinking about that subject. It is a love token, either given to, or I think given to, but possibly from a sailor called Peter Barnes. And it says, I'm trying to see, when this you see, remember me. A love token that he would have exchanged with a sweetheart, and given them something to think about when they were away, a way of remembering each other. And I've often talked about this object before, but I have to say, after the last sort of 18 months, objects like this have become even more laden with meaning. I think every single person here over the last year and a half has had to put up with absence from loved ones for some period of time. And we have to say that we're fortunate. We have Zoom, we have Teams, we have phones, we have all sorts of means of communication where even if we can't see friends and loved ones, we have been able through some means or another to remain in touch. This just was not possible for an 18th century sailor. A few could write, we know that for sure, but others could not. And so they would often be gone for years at a time. And so an object like this might be the only way that they can materially think about and engage with a loved one who might be many, many tens, if not hundreds of miles away. When we think about the 18th century social world, a lot of historians say that it's all about consensus. For a ship to work well, everyone needed to be on the same page and working together. And for the most part, this is true. And actually, one of the interesting things about Trafalgar is the extent to which in British ships, certainly this worked. When it comes down to it, an officer on the poop deck is absolutely reliant on his sailors performing their tasks with expertise, with precision, just as they are absolutely reliant on that officer making the right call at the right time. But one of the things I'm interested in is what happens when that consensus breaks down. Obviously, life in the Navy was very brutal, certainly by today's standards and arguably by the standards of the time as well. Punishment was very harsh. Mutiny, particularly towards the end of the 18th century, was becoming very common. So if I might do a sort of advanced plug for a forthcoming book, do look out in all good bookshops in a year or two's time where there will be a book with my name on it talking about these sorts of issues. Lastly, though, I want to think about what the battle meant for those people who fought in it later in the 19th century. And there's a few examples where sailors who fought at Trafalgar survived into the 1840s, the 1850s, and the age of photography, which I always just think is wonderful that you have sailors fighting in the 18th century at the Battle of Trafalgar as well. But we have photographs of them. So there's a couple of examples here on the screen, James Sharman and James Spratt, who were both there on the 21st of October, 1805. What I think is interesting, particularly about Sharman, is that he's photographed wearing his Trafalgar medal, the medal that he was given for his service in that battle. So clearly, many, many decades later, again, this still means something to him. This is still a defining moment in his life and something he wants to be immortalized on film. We might also think about how actually sailors finished their lives. And I think I'm right in saying that George King ended up at the Greenwich Hospital, which is this wonderful institution created in, well, in the late 17th century, but not really fully operational until the 18th century, whereby sailors who had retired or were injured could receive a pension and go and be looked after in Greenwich Hospital. And so this is this really interesting institution. It continues right into the 19th century. It's this early example of state welfare, basically. It's all funded by the government. And it's also one of the first buildings that a visitor to London would see. In this period, most visitors coming from abroad would have arrived up the River Thames. And as you come up the River Thames, this Greenwich Hospital on the south bank of the Thames would have been one of the first buildings you saw, this huge monument demonstrating this is how we look after our sailors. There was a very clear sort of patriotic and more psychological purpose to it. But I think I'm going to stop talking here, locating the end of our story at Greenwich Hospital, which is, of course, where George King's story finished too. So I'll stop talking there and look forward to talking more about this subject.
That's great. I learned a lot there. And that very last image is actually in the exhibition, so our audience today might be interested to go and have a look at the actual picture.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very illuminating from both of you. Thank you very much. Yeah, please do pop questions into the chat or any sort of comments or feedback you'd like to give us. That would be fantastic. Do pop them in there. I haven't seen anything come up yet, but this is your opportunity to ask our experts. So please do pop questions in there for me. I was really struck by the love token, because I think obviously for me that's one of the sort of best known objects or collection of objects in our museum is the tokens that mothers left with their babies when they were admitted to the hospital as kind of forms of recognition, I suppose, to enable them to reclaim the child should that become a possibility. And there are quite a few examples that are quite similar to the token that you showed. So I think sometimes it's about, it might be the token that they've had from the father of the child, potentially. You know, you get that sense that that's sometimes what's going in as the token for the child. But there's also, the hospital has a policy of allowing children to come in who are the children of people who fought in the army or navy. So if they're orphans, they actually can come in at an older age. So normally children were admitted to the Foundling Hospital under 1 year old, but they make an exception to admit the children of sailors and soldiers. So I think that's quite an interesting kind of connection to make, that, you know, there would be children coming in who were the children of people like George King. You talk about Nelson as a commoner. I find that really interesting. How did he rise from those sort of humble beginnings? How did he get into the kind of officer class? How did that happen? You know, it's obviously not something that happened for George, so I'm quite intrigued.
So there's two sides to this question. On the one hand, the Navy was, certainly by the standards of the time, an incredibly meritocratic institution. You could join as a sailor and rise to become an officer, and you did so if you were good at it. So the Navy has this policy where if you want to be a commissioned officer, you have to have served 6 years at sea, you have to have that amount of experience, and then you have to pass an exam. But basically, so long as you could read, as long as you were literate, and as long as you had got that experience, you could take this exam and potentially pass. What's also interesting is that even very well-connected people that join the Navy have to go through this process. So you have the younger brother of the king, who's in the Navy in the 18th century, and he has to do this too. He has to spend 6 years on a ship doing all the yucky jobs, frankly, before he's able to become a commissioned officer. So what this means is, to become an officer, it was open to many. I won't say it was open to all, but it was open to many. And it also meant that if you became an officer, it generally meant you were pretty good at it. Now, of course, the other side of the coin is that if you have connections, if you have patronage, particularly if you have connections within the Navy, it was much easier for you. But what's really interesting, if you look at the sort of cadre of officers that are fighting at Trafalgar, so think about and think about their family backgrounds, they're all relatively lowly. So Nelson is the son of a country parson. Collingwood is the son of a merchant captain. Trowbridge is the son of a pastry chef. You know, these are not people coming from the aristocracy or even the upper middling classes. These are young men who have chosen the Navy partly for reasons of patriotism, partly for reasons of just to make some money, but also because it's an institution where they can improve their social status.
So we've got lots of questions popping into the boxes now. Was the first one from Sharon is, was Trafalgar Day celebrated during the Napoleonic Wars? I mean, did those celebrations start straight away, or was that something that came later?
Yeah, it comes later. A few newspapers note the anniversary of it in the subsequent years, and sort of it allows them to fill some column inches by just reprinting what they'd written the year before. But it's really something that happens later into the 19th century. I mean, Helen might want to come in here, but after the Napoleonic Wars, actually suddenly people stopped being interested for a while. It takes a long time for Trafalgar Square and Nelson's Column to be organized. There's a very famous line as well in Jane Austen's Sanditon, where one of the characters says, you know, one of the characters has named their house Trafalgar House, and another character criticizes them for it and saying, no one cares about Trafalgar now. Why didn't you call it Waterloo House? So it's something that comes in later in the 19th century, and really Trafalgar Day and Navy Days as a moment for tens upon tens of thousands of people across the nation to come together. It's really an early 20th century thing, when Britain, in the midst of a whole new arms race, this time against Germany rather than France, found another reason to meet Nelson again.
Yes, yeah.
It's a living memory. I mean, I was speaking to a member of the older generation in the 80s now who remembered Trafalgar Day growing up. It was like Empire Day. So it was all part of that idea of constructing the story of, you know, Britain's quote imperial glory. But that wasn't so very long ago that they were still doing that. I understand there was always a separate day because Trafalgar Day was quite a solemn day because of Nelson's death. It was quite reverential in the early 20th century. But there's another day where traditionally everyone got roaringly drunk, and there might be someone on this call who might be able to name that day. It was someone who was a yachtsman who told me this, that there is a separate day where everyone celebrates Trafalgar by getting roaringly drunk, and that still goes on today, even though I think Trafalgar Day has pretty much disappeared, unless there are enthusiasts who want to keep memorializing it.
So I've got another quick Trafalgar one. Were there any women present at the battle?
Such a good question.
We know for a fact that there were a couple wives of warrant officers on board. More than that, we don't know for sure, but we do know that across the long 18th century, there were women on board ships. There's a really interesting archaeological dig done in Aboukir Bay, where Nelson had won a previous victory in 1798 at the Battle of the Nile, and they basically found all of these skeletons, and some of them are women. So we know that there were women on ships. Again, likely the officers of petty and warrant officers rather than anything more salacious. Definitely there is a trope at the time that of women dressing up as men to go to sea as sailors. There are some recorded instances of that happening, though as with good stories, one suspects it probably didn't happen as often as some fiction writers in the 18th century would have liked to have believed. But yeah, so there were women at Trafalgar, but probably not very many.
So on sort of similar but different lines, I've got a question from Anthony. It seems that the boys at the Foundling Hospital were perhaps seen to have a kind of function on the national stage in the Navy, for instance. But was there similar kind of national importance placed on any of the roles that the girls might undertake as adults?
That's a really great question. And as are all of them. I'm watching them coming through in the chat. That's really interesting. Not in such an explicit way. I mean, not linked indirectly to the Army and the Navy, for example. I mean, most of the girls were destined for housework and an honest living made through the kinds of occupations that you would have expected low status girls and women at the time to engage in. So they would have been servants and engaged in handicrafts. And they were educated with that in mind. So they would have had basic literacy to allow them to read scripture. They weren't taught to write in the same way that the boys were. And they would have been expected to have a decent apron on leaving the hospital, and that would allow them to earn an honest living, because to be honest, before they were married, their options were very few otherwise. So the vast majority went on to a life in service, as far as we can tell. I mean, during times of war, there is more pressure on women generally to marry and have lots of babies. So the rhetoric was around their sexual propriety as they were growing up. You would have known it would have been a shameful thing to have been, quote, like your mother, and these girls were most likely illegitimate and the result of illegitimate unions between people who weren't married. So I don't think we should underplay the stigma of that. But they were encouraged to marry and to have lots of children during periods of conflict, and that was their main purpose, really.
So were all of the foundlings taught to read and write, or did their educations vary?
Yeah, I think it depended very much, and it's a very strong theme in our exhibition, the fact that George could write as well as read, which was a definite advantage, and compared to the level of education received by children who were raised at the expense of the parish in workhouses, it was a remarkable level of education for poor boys to be able to read. So there is a letter in the exhibition written by Robert Aitchison, who was George's teacher, and he was a reforming schoolmaster. So he obviously spotted bright boys who were keen to learn, took them under his wing. But it was a subsection even within the group of boys to learn how to write. And Robert Aitchison would have only been able to do that for quite a small number. And as I've said, there was really no incentive for girls to learn to write in the same way.
Yeah, it does increase a little bit as the 19th century goes on. And certainly in the early 20th century, there were some of the girls were actually being sent to grammar schools, the ones who were particularly able. So, but it's very clear from early on that the girls are being taught to read, and a very small number start to do some writing and arithmetic sort of as you go into the 19th century, but it's few and far between. It's not considered as important for them at all.
And it's really heartbreaking, isn't it? That there's a suggestion they should found a music school at one point, and money is raised. I'm talking way back in the 1700s, which is the bit of this story that I know best. But the idea is that we don't want to educate children in this way because it's not suitable for their social status.
Yes.
So
yeah,
this isn't about realizing their potential.
We have a response from somebody who belongs to a yacht club who says that they will be celebrating Trafalgar tonight. Dress code, very formal, medals if you have them, evening dress for the ladies, but it's not somber or sober.
I'm glad to hear that. And the formality, that's interesting.
I think George King would definitely approve of that. So.
Well, there's a lot of rum drinking, and I hope you'll toast George this evening. I think that's wonderful, Karen.
I think we definitely should. I've got an interesting question, which is, was Admiral Collingwood any relation to Thomas Collingwood, who was Secretary of the Foundling Hospital? I think the straightforward answer to that is I don't know. I don't think so. We've done a little bit of work around Thomas Collingwood and his family tree, because we have a portrait of somebody who's supposed to be his wife, who definitely isn't his wife, further research has revealed, but we don't quite know what relationship she has to him. So I think it's one of those things that it's become an urban myth that this is Collingwood's wife, but her name isn't correct for that relationship. So more work to be done on that, but I haven't come across that connection. There are one or two connections. So we know one of the things in the exhibition are two letters from the Foundling Hospital matron, Hannah Johnson, to Lady Emma Hamilton, and she's inquiring about one of the Foundling boys who's on board Nelson's ship. But she also inquires after her own nephew, who is a midshipman on board at the same time. So there are obviously these kind of social connections and family relationships with people who are in the Navy, but I'm not sure that there's that particular relationship. Let's just see. Oh, what happened to George King later in life? I think you'll have to come and see the exhibition. I don't know if you want to answer that, Helen.
I think we can just safely say that those photographs blew me away, actually, James, that some of these men survived into ripe old age after everything they'd been through. George had a remarkable 24 years at sea, mostly in the Royal Navy, but then also in the Merchant Navy. That can't have been very typical, because of ill health and injury and the battles they endured, the disease. Many of them didn't live long enough to pensionable age, but George did and survived many perils. And that's in the story in the exhibition is of his global travels across the oceans, which include a trip to South Carolina, remarkably, on the eve of the abolition of enslavement in the British Empire. So there's a real connection there with Britain's maritime trade links and the Merchant Navy as well. Like many demobbed sailors, he finds it difficult to find work. So we've mentioned the fact that he ends up in Greenwich Hospital. That did, I think, save his life, because it was looking pretty desperate for him. He couldn't find work. But it gave him the means for an honest living as a clerk of the hospital. So perhaps I should leave a slight cliffhanger. The answer will be on the video, on the tour. But the story actually doesn't end with Greenwich Hospital, surprisingly. He has a last-minute surprise up his sleeve in his 60s, including something involving a lady who's much younger than him. It's a bit of a theme here.
Oh. So I've got a sort of question that kind of, I think, sits quite well with that, which is, what was the usual length of service in the Royal Navy?
The simple answer is, how long is the war? During peacetime, the Navy was incredibly small. 95% of its ships would be laid up in dockyards. But it's that with only maybe 4,000 sailors, 5,000 sailors who are serving on ships that are often working on trade protection and putting down piracy and the sort of run-of-the-mill tasks of the Navy. At the start of a war, though, comes huge mobilization and this incredible need for trained maritime labor. So in 1793 and then again in 1803, you see this huge recruitment drive where the number of men in the Navy would go from a few thousand up to, at its height, about 147,000 men.
Oh,
which, considering that the population of Britain at the time was maybe 15 to 20 million, it's a huge proportion of the national workforce. As I said, some sailors volunteered, many others were impressed and forced in against their will. And even volunteers would become coerced in their own way. The Navy had this policy of turning over men, which basically meant when a ship had finished its voyage, say after a couple of years, the men on that ship would be turned over to another ship, and the men would have very little say in which ship they went to, and certainly would not be given the opportunity to go on land again. So basically, once you were in, the Navy and the British state was very, very good at hanging on to your labor. The other side of the coin, of course, is at the end of a war, you have very, very speedy demobilization as the state desperately tries to stop spending money. So what you see certainly in 1815 is huge numbers, tens upon tens of thousands of sailors who are released from the Navy, essentially into unemployment and poverty. It also combines with a European recession. And it's a pretty brutal time and horrific time for a lot of these sailors, men who had fought for many years, served their country, but their country did not really pay them back afterwards. You know, we know, for example, that at the Peterloo Massacre in 1819, that there were sailors there protesting about the way that they'd been treated. And in this way, the experience of naval sailors is just one part of this bigger national picture.
Mm. So we have a question which is about what was the sort of pensionable age for the Navy. So I know that George King talks about, he inquires what his pension will be after he's done 16 years. And he gets a kind of quote, and he decides, and he's told that he'll get a better pension if he completes 21 years.
Mm.
And he's 3 months short at the end of a kind of a long voyage. And he ends up taking another voyage, which lasts nearly 3 years. So he ends up, that's how he ends up doing the 24, because he's trapped, really. He needs to do those few months. So, you know, and even then, it's clearly not actually enough for him to live on.
I think he's entitled at the end of all that slog to £16 a year.
Yes.
Now, that is not far off a labourer's wage, but a labourer would have had the physical strength to have, you know, supplemented it in various ways. He was in pretty bad health at that point in his early 50s. So in the late 40s, early 50s, as a demobbed ordinary seaman, you were often in a bad way, if not with an actual disability. So I think the desperation really comes through. And you can tell he's so relieved after his last voyage ends. He heaves his bedding over the edge of the ship. He talks about doing that, which is a surefire way of saying, I am never getting on a boat again, you know, even if he wanted to.
I think we've got to the end of our questions, but do shout up if I've missed something that you've asked. Do pop up in the chat, but I think that's everyone. So it just remains to say thank you very much indeed to our panelists today. That's been really fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned quite a lot, actually.